So thank you, Barry. All yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to see familiar names and faces. And I want to start by discussing the cover of our book that has quotations that are interesting to me, including two poems. Well, the first is by Robert Frost, one of my favorite 20th century poets. And we will get to a long poem by Frost maybe next week in the book. But this is a most interesting quote. Like a piece of ice on a hot stove, a poem must ride on its own melting. And that's like a poem in itself, but it's an observation about how poetry works. Good poetry, particularly lyric poetry, which is what we mostly look at, must have a feeling of spontaneity, as if it's coming out of itself, as if the artist, the poet, had no preconception of where it was going to go. So it's that the language of a poem generates more language until it finds itself. So this is a little piece of critical theory. Like a piece of ice on a hot stove, a poem must ride its own melting. It's a beautiful way of looking at poetic composition. So I start with that. Next, I want to look at this little haiku-esque poem by Ezra Pound. He wrote this in 1913 in Paris. He had a spiritual moment. He was looking at the subway crowd, and these words came to him, but not in this condensed form. This was revised from a 40-page poem down to these 2 lines. But the 40-page poem did include this. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So it's one of my favorite poems to introduce a poetry class with. The apparition of these faces in the crowd is a perfect iambic pentameter line. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. The music of it is very familiar. The man walked down the street. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. And then that rhythm is completely violated in the second line. Petals on a wet black bough. It's staccato. It's the opposite. So to put these 2 separate rhythms back to back, side by side, not only do you catch your audience with it, but it's a stunning achievement. And this might be one of Pound's most famous short poems, written in 1913. I wrote a 30-page essay about this poem as part of my doctoral dissertation, approaching it as a political work. I'd love it if somebody in our group could guess, how in the world do you get politics out of this? I don't see any hands up. So
Let's see.
nope.
No, I don't think I do either. I'm just double checking. Nope.
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit because in the middle of Ezra Pound's life, he got caught up in fascist ideals, and he became a supporter of Mussolini first, and then of the anti-Semitic vitriol of the Nazis. This seems to be an innocent enough poem. And it's curious because of the word apparition. The word apparition has the word appearance built into it. The appearance of these faces reminds me of petals on a wet black bough, and that could seem to be an extremely positive vision of humanity, a democratic vision. He's in the subway where all kinds of colors are arrayed. But the word apparition is not the word appearance. An apparition is a ghost, the apparition of something dead. Our most famous apparitions appear in the plays of Shakespeare and Macbeth and Hamlet. The ghost of Hamlet's father first appears as an apparition. So he's seeing these people in the subway as the living dead. And they are stuck. Petals on a wet black bough could be seen as beautiful because the petals could be multicolored, and they're stuck on a wet black bough. There's been a rainstorm, or rain at least, that makes the bough sticky, so the petals stick on it. The petals are dislocated. They're dead or dying, and they're dislocated. They're no longer on their stems. They're on the bough itself. So he's accomplished something that is very complicated. He sees these figures, he elevates them with the word apparitions, so they become like heroic figures, because most apparitions in literature, whether it's in the Divine Comedy, in Homer, in Shakespeare, most apparitions are heroic. The heroic dead. So on the one hand, Pound is elevating these ordinary subway faces to the status of an apparition, and then he kills them off, but sticks them on the bough where they are colorful. So one could say already in 1913, one can sense Ezra Pound's right-wing ideology. But the reality is we are struck by the vividness of this image and the inventiveness of the language. Petals on a wet black bough. All those consonants dominating. All the verbs dominating in line 1. The apparition and their soft vowels. Faces in the crowd. And crowd and bow almost rhyme. They don't quite rhyme. It's called a slant rhyme. So he's whittled down this long poem into a short haiku-esque poem that people don't stop talking about. Since 1913 till now, more than 100 years, people are still writing about this short 2-line poem. And I just wanted to start the class with it because it's easy to get hold of these 2 lines on the cover of a book. Does anybody have a thought about it that you'd like to share?
Let's see. I don't see any. Bert wants to comment, and Martha. So let's do Bert first, and then Martha, please.
Hi, Judy. Hi, Barry. Nice to see you both. Nice to see the class back. Barry, I believe we read this poem some time ago.
Thank you for remembering.
Yeah, I do remember. Unfortunately, I don't remember, the details and the some of what you just mentioned in terms of his political views. But yeah, I know Pound. That's interesting that back in 13 had views that really didn't come to fruition until sometime later.
Yep. Now, there are a few poems I like in every semester when I collect poems for this booklet. I don't like to repeat myself too much, but there are 3 or 4 or 5 or a dozen even poems that are very important to me and my education. And this is one of them. So every few years, I will stick it in the poetry book that I put together. And I hope to continue doing that. Should we
Okay.
look at the W.H. Auden? Also on the-
Wait, Martha wanted to comment on this
Oh,
one.
yes, please.
Yep. Yep. Go ahead, Martha.
Okay. Hi, guys. So
Hi.
good to see you. The second line, petals, which are separated from they are petals only the part of the flower, and they're separated, and they're on a wet black bough. The black bough is the kicker here for me. You know, I mean, that's of course deadly and ominous, and the petals being the colorful, but the wet black bough takes it on another level.
Yep. Also, we have to imagine it's in a station of the metro, and the tunnel. The faces are seen against the dark tunnel as the petals are against the dark bough. So it's an image that is faithful to the station, the subway station, but it's also suggestive of the bough of a tree and how the petals get stuck on there. Yeah, this is a little thing we could talk about for a long time when we come back to it. But the other one, Epitaph on a Tyrant, since tyrants seem to be elevated more lately than some years ago, this poem by Auden, which was written, I think, during the Spanish Civil War when the tyrant Generalissimo Franco came to power, seems ever relevant. Epitaph on a Tyrant. Perfection of a kind was what he was after. That makes us think a lot about the word perfection from a political right-wing perspective. Perfection of a kind was what he was after, and the poetry he invented was easy to understand. He knew human folly like the back of his hand and was greatly interested in armies and fleets. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter, and when he cried, the little children died in the streets. So it's a serious little 6-line poem with rhymes. Understand hand, fleets, streets, and he breaks up the rhyme with non-rhyming lines as well. And it's chilling. It's chilling. It's a real experiment in saying something in an almost jolly way, when at the same time it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up with fear. And when he cried, little children died in the streets. And having that internal rhyme, cried and died, within the line, lightens it up in a deceptive way. So you can be both entertained by it and disturbed by it, all in once, all at once. And it also makes you think, what the devil is he talking about with that word perfection? Perfection was of a kind was what he was after. Well, perfection for this tyrant might be staying in power. He doesn't mean perfection, obviously, in any way that a humanist would accept the word perfection. So this is something that you could scribble on a wall. All right, that's the cover.
Bert, I think Bert wanted to comment on this one?
Yeah. Uh, yeah, I thought of perfection so aptly describes always wanting to be right, no matter what, having to lie or distort to come out as being right, no matter what
Yep.
the situation. I think of it, that certainly fits, I think, a lot of tyrants and certainly the current one.
Mhm.
Thank you. Yes, yes. It's an interesting word, and it's extremely ambiguous. And Auden is gone. We cannot ask him, what did you mean by that? And that leaves us free to really the expansiveness of the word. Perfection. Of course, when he says of a kind, is a wonderful lure for the reader to say, well, what kind? And there's no way to answer that incorrectly. Whatever reading you have of that is your reading. And it's as authentic as any other reading.
When you
Well-
think of the current person never admitting that he's wrong, there's a sense of perfection,
Yep,
or some sense of it there.
yep. All right, let's jump ahead to this little poem, by the way. Oh, we didn't look at that. I'm sorry. On the cover is a very late version of a poem by Marianne Moore entitled Poetry. And her original poem, Poetry, was 1919. There it is. But the version on the cover was the one she preferred for her final collected poetry. So if we can again go back to the cover, David, for a second. This is the version that is in her collected poems, and it was the final version that she liked. There were a dozen versions of this poem between 1919 and her final collection. But this was one that she thought was in a way a rebuke to all the critics that had written reams about the longer version, the original version. She condensed it to this: poetry. I too dislike it. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. So she felt that was enough.
Right.
But the original, which is on page 62 of our book, David has it on the screen. It's a long poem. I too dislike it. There are things more important beyond all this fiddle. And this was such a famous poem that there's a book called Beyond All This Fiddle. And I don't remember if it's a critical text or a novel, but Marianne Moore, who along with Ezra Pound, was responsible for what's called the birth of modernism at the early part of the century. And much of it has to do with defending the uses of poetry. I'll try not to interrupt. I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Now we come to the physical genuine. Hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise, if it must. These things are important, not because a high-sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, the same thing may be said of all of us, that we do not admire what we cannot understand. The bat holding on upside down or in quest of something to eat, elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a roll, a tireless wolf under a tree, the immovable critic twinkling his skin like a horse that feels a flea, the baseball fan, the statistician. Case after case could be cited, did one wish it. Nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. Business documents and school books, all these phenomena are important. One must make a distinction, however. When dragged into prominence by half-poets, the result is not poetry. Nor till the autocrats among us can be literalists of the imagination, above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection, and these are the most famous lines in the poem, and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them. Shall we have it? In the meantime, if you demand on the one hand, in defiance of their opinion, the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is, on the other hand, genuine, then you are interested in poetry. So this early in the 20th century, 1919 still, towards the end of World War I, when modernist art, whether in music, in painting, was fragmenting the narrative. This breaks away from a story. It's not really telling a story. It's giving us a series of images, all very physical and sensual. And it's even sensual when she gets into baseball. Marianne Moore was a serious baseball fan. And she was also a serious boxing fan. And interesting to remember, she was a pal of Muhammad Ali. It's a wonderful photograph of Muhammad Ali embracing Marianne Moore in her old age. All these phenomena are important. Anyway, I'd love to hear any reactions to this at all. By the way, the quotation marks around literalists of the imagination, it's a paraphrase of a praising comment by the poet, the Irish poet, W.B. Yeats, when he was thinking about the poetry of William Blake. And he spoke about the imagination and how literal Blake could be. But she mangled the quotation, puts it in quotes for a joke. So one of the elements of modernism, whether you're talking about James Joyce's Ulysses or Virginia Woolf's experimental novels, was to make references to other works of literature as if every reader would understand where that came from. And this is what Marianne Moore is doing here with those quotation marks.
So we have a couple people want to comment. We can go to Helene and then Bert. We always go to somebody who hasn't spoken yet, and Martha. Okay, so Helene, Bert, and then Martha. Helene.
Thank you. I like the way you brought it out in the fullness of it. And what I'm impressed with, I feel, is that she's really kind of showing the importance of the written word, and yet independence of mind. And I find that interesting, you know, especially as a woman and all, that it's not about even the critic. It's about independence in your own thinking and doing what you know is important. And I like that.
Thank you very much, Helene. I totally agree. I totally agree with that.
Okay. By the way, I found the photo I just sent that you mentioned with Marion Moore and Ali. I just sent a link to David because I was trouble showing it. Okay, we can go to Bert next, and then Martha, and then David, if you can show the photo, that would be great. Go ahead, Bert.
Yeah. Well, of course, Muhammad Ali was a poet of a sort himself. But you know, she mentions a lot of different words that may be used in poetry, and a number of them come up in the poems that we're reading today. Several of the words that she mentions that appear in the poems that we'll discuss later.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Martha, come on in.
There is something about the structure of this and the way it's put together, the use of short lines and long lines and some various tropes that I can't identify, but I know are there. That makes this so wonderful. I just very simply, the statistician, case after case could be cited, did not wish it, nor is it valid. What a line to listen to it, to discriminate against business documents. It's phenomenal in that. And again, I'm not sophisticated enough to highlight what I'm talking about, but I know it's there.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because the way the lines are arranged on the page has as much to do with the pleasure the poem gives us as its, quote, meaning or meanings, and contributes to its meanings. So should we go on to the next?
Well, let's see if we can show that photo. David, can you
Okay.
use that link? Show the photo of Ali and Moore. Let's see if we can do that briefly. See, it's a fun one, so if we can't, we'll move on.
I don't have that photo at hand. I'm sorry to say.
I sent you a link in chat. Did you try that?
Oh, in chat. Oh, very well then.
Yeah.
Surely, by all means.
Okay, give us a second, everyone. We don't want to take too much time away from Barry, but I think you can do it.
There it is.
With this, yes.
That's the one. Yep.
That's it. I love the hands.
Yeah.
The expressions are great, aren't they?
Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
great photo.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, David. We can go back to real poetry now.
So
Okay,
Now we go to Shakespeare.
okay. And we have no photographs of Shakespeare.
No,
Mhm.
no. Especially none with Muhammad Ali.
It's true. Mhm.
So this passage from The Tempest contains some of Shakespeare's most famous and oft-quoted lines. And The Tempest was one of his final plays. And the character Prospero, for those who may have forgotten the story, Prospero was abandoned on this island by his usurping brother, and he becomes a magician. And right before this scene, which is in Act 4, he has called up various spirits to entertain the assemblage. Our revels now are ended. That is the performance that he generated with his magic, where sprites and so forth put on a mask or a play. So these actors were from another universe, from the spirit universe. So I'll just read this beautiful passage, but it's Prospero, the magician, speaking to a small audience. But I should also say that he's being challenged. His life is in danger from the monster Caliban, who lives on this island. He's got to strategically deal with this monster. And at the end of the speech, he's aware that he's got to take care. And his much-loved daughter, Miranda, is about to marry the son of his usurping brother's enemy. That's enough. Our revels now are ended. Well, this passage is so rich that I'm going to try not to interrupt but our revels now are ended. While it's referring to the play that he just generated, could also be suggestive of the end of one's life. Our revels now are ended. That period of life that could be seen as energetic, full of adventure. And the whole passage seems to be suggestive of reality versus fantasy, life versus its ending. All right, that's enough. Our revels are now ended. These, our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, ye all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. And our little life is rounded with a sleep. Sir, I am vexed. Bear with my weakness. My brain is troubled. Be not disturbed with my infirmity. If you be pleased, retire to my cell, and there repose. A turn or two I'll walk, to still my beating mind. So Prospero needs to take a break right after this play to still my beating mind. Everybody who's witnessing the play at this point knows that suddenly Caliban has come into his head and he's got to be careful. And his mind is beating with contrary emotions. One, fear for his life, that the monster Caliban, even though he can protect himself with his magic, he's still in danger. But on the other hand, his daughter is about to marry, and he's very happy about that. So he's, as all of us all of us recognize moments in our lives when we are challenged by alternative emotions. The joy of a child finding love, the terror of something awful that could happen at any moment, whether it's a political emergency, a storm emergency, an enemy at the door, whatever. So this passage has in it all of those conspiring dread, celebration, a play, a reality. And these lines written around 1610, early 17th century, have only grown more and more important as the centuries with its decades have gone on, because they've been written about so much and performed so much. The Tempest, as we speak, is probably being played somewhere or prepared for in preparation for a performance somewhere at a university, in Spanish, in Bengali, in whatever languages. It's worth reading and rereading and rereading, not just this passage from The Tempest, but there are a dozen, at least, famous passages from that wonderful play, which I was lucky enough to see performed by Joseph Papp in Central Park when I was 19 years old.
Mm.
And I can remember it. James Earl Jones played Caliban, and it stays. To see it performed helps keep it in the memory. When he says, by the way, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind, he creates a shipwreck that endangers the tyrant brother that he does away with. And leave not a rack behind, that's a shipwreck. Although it can be open to whatever interpretation the reader cares to impose upon it. And he comments about Shakespeare's passage from Act 4, Scene 1.
Bert wanted to comment. We'd love to hear from some other people too. Bert, can you come on screen, and you have to unmute?
Yeah, I think it's his view of life there is, I think, so different than a religious view, and I wonder if that in any way caused any difficulty or was criticized. And the other comment, often I think people think of it as we are such stuff as dreams are made of, but it's made on.
That's right.
Which,
yeah, that would be a mangling of the quote.
Yeah, I mean,
we are such stuff as dreams are made on. You build on us. That's beautiful, Bert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Martha also wanted to comment.
Let me just say one other thing. In reaction to Bert's observation here, there's another poem that I put in our book, season after season. It's not in the current book, but it's that poem by Robert Frost called Out, Out, which is an elegy on the death of a boy from a buzzsaw accident. And he says in that poem, nothing more to build on. And it's the same use, to build on. A life is something to build on. And I think it's a very similar emotion available in this passage. Martha?
Thank you. I love every single line he's ever written, of course. But look at the last line here. To still my beating mind. come on. I mean, what happened to the beating heart, you know?
Yes, yes,
Beating mind. And
right.
so I get it, you know. It's so dramatic and intense.
Right. And it also would suggest to us how close the mind and the heart.
And the heart are.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we go to the next.
Mhm.
Okay. So this is section 6 from Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. And it's a long poem, very spiritual. I'll stop myself once or twice through it. Otherwise, I'm going to just try to read it. A child said, "What is the grass?" A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Now, the flag of my disposition, the flag is a symbol. His disposition is his mood. So he's writing this out of a specific mood. And the flag of my disposition is that the grass is all positive. My disposition is an open disposition. It's a spiritual disposition. It sees the grass in everything, the flag of my disposition. It's a metaphor for the whole poem. So now I'll go on and try not to muck it up with my interruptions. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer, designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white. Canuck, Tuckahoo, Congressman, Cuff, I give them the same. I receive them the same. And now, it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. Tenderly, I will use your curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be, if I had known them, I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people and from women and from the offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. And here you are, the mother's laps. The grass is very dark. David, thank you. The grass is very dark to brief from where the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. Oh, I perceived after all so many uttering tongues, and I perceive they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing. I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about old men and mothers, and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. By the way, this was written during the Civil War. where Walt Whitman serves as a nurse. So the references to people taken too soon has a specific reference. What do you think has become of the young and old men? What do you think has become of the women and the children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprouts show there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and forward. All goes onward and outward, and nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. And we are lucky that Walt Whitman was not only an adventurous user of the language and formed a new kind of poetry built out of common speech, but we were also lucky that he had this spirituality that all goes onward and outward and nothing collapses. And even if you do not share his spirituality, where he sees life in all things and sees the grass as containing everlasting life. Somewhere else he says, when you step on the grass, you step on me. That it contains multitudes. So we are lucky, even if we do not share, for whatever reasons, are unable to share his spirituality. When you're engaged in his poetry, you accept his spirituality because it's what's moving the verses line by line. And that's one of the pleasures of poetry, that you can be in the midst of a religious experience in a poem while not otherwise sharing that religion. And I think of the wonderful poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, of so many, of John Donne, thinking particularly now of specific poems by poets that were engaged in spiritual endeavor or spiritual recognition, as this one, a most spiritual poem. When I'm in it, I am that spiritual person. When I close the book, maybe some of it lingers, certainly. So this is an extraordinary section 6 of Song of Myself by Walt Whitman. And it's worth picking up that long, long poem and swimming in it. And it's also, I didn't say at the top, a hymn to democracy. He was very much alone in the 1850s, saying the blacks and the whites are equal in his disposition. The flag of my disposition is a democratic flag. I perceive, after all, so many uttering tongues. You know, he lived in Brooklyn, and there were immigrants all over the place. So many uttering tongues, so many uttering languages. Darker. The grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men. So there's your democratic spirit and your convincing spirituality of Walt Whitman. Any comments on this?
Yes, we have, I'm going to call on Richard Schiffman and then Bert. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I don't know what I can add to what Walt Whitman has said. I mean, this is a poem that I read when I was young. I must have been 12 or 13, and it had a really deep impact on me. Somehow I recognized that spirituality, that you were talking about, Barry, and resonated with it. It may be worth mentioning that that was a time when the Hindu classics like the Bhagavad Gita were first being translated into English. And Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman all read this classic. So he would have been aware of the idea of reincarnation. And you definitely have a sense of that belief in the poem. In fact, I think there are poems where Whitman talks about being a yogi. He identifies so strongly with that tradition and with the idea of rebirth and reincarnation. But the poem's not really an argument for reincarnation. It's more the way poems are, kind of a, I don't know, expression of something beyond even the ideology of it. And the way that he brings together, I mean, you mentioned democracy. Well, the grass sort of brings together old men, young men, black, white. It's a symbol for something universal that, like the sun, the rays of the sun shine on everyone and everything. In the same way, the grass is there for all of us. So it's kind of a symbol that brings everything together. But a beautiful poem. I'm not sure that I've added anything, but
Yes, thank you very much, Richard, for what you just said. And I kind of smile at one of his inclusions, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, and he puts congressmen in there.
Uh-huh.
right. Well, that's a hard one for all of us to include.
Yeah.
But yeah, even congressmen are part of this one life. So.
And also, I am very moved by the opening, that this is all sparked by a child. This all comes out of innocence. A child said, "What is the grass?" How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. And then he goes on and lets us know what it means to him after confessing at the top that he doesn't know. So that's a marvelous paradox on which this poem rests or rides.
Right, but his conclusions about it aren't like logical conclusions. Like this is what grass is. It's just this great poetic invention. Like it's just everything. it's part and parcel of everything.
And
So yeah, it's beautiful.
Leads to this wonderful thing: to die is different for anyone supposed, and luckier.
Right. Well, and for those who followed near-death experiences, I think we get a sense of how that may be true when people report what their state is as they get close to death. I think that Whitman was picking up on that reality. So anyway.
Does anyone else have anything to say?
Yeah, Bert, go ahead, Bert.
Yeah, well, I was going to say some of the same things about his democracy views. There's really a wonderful concern for every living thing. It's really an emotional concern as well as a ideological view of democracy. And I love the way he goes from this simple question to cover so much else in the poem. I mean, it just goes on to deal with such important aspects of life. It's really very moving.
Thank you. Let's go, and we've got time for one more, Judy.
Yeah, let's squeeze in a quick comment from Helene, and then, yes, we do have time. Go ahead, Helene.
Thank you. I think the smallest sprouts show there is really no death. I don't know of all of you, but I know so often I am amazed in awe of the little bit of green that will come into the concrete. And it sort of seems to me that just that line alone is almost everything that he is saying. And it's so fabulous that shows it, in a way, the oneness of it all. That even in concrete, you see the green and the beauty and the life. And he is actually the little child in a way to us. It's wonderful when you explain it, especially. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we can
Yeah,
move-
there's time for another poem if you want to go ahead.
Yes, because it's short. And it's one we have looked at once or twice in the 10 years I've been happily with the CLNL. The Lake Isle of Innisfree is an early poem by the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. And it does contain a reference to spirituality. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. By the way, this has been set to music and sung by Joan Baez and any number of other singers. It's been set to instrumental music. It's a lyric. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bleak bee loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, from peace, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There, midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray and hear it in the deep heart's core. So it's a song poem by Ireland's most lyrical of poets, William Butler Yeats. And when I mentioned spirituality, that comes in the third line of the poem. He's imagining a place far from where he stands that is bucolic and peaceful. And he's got a little garden. 9 bean rows will I have there. So why the number 9? The number 9 is, in various religions, a mystical number of perfection. So he's trying to imagine, or he is imagining, a place that is as close to perfection as his mind can conjure. 9 bean rows will I have there. It's a symbol of order, perfection, rationality. So he's creating in his mind an ideal place, quite different from where he stands on the roadway or on the pavement's gray. And he composed this while visiting in London and missing
Ireland.
a Lake Isle of Innisfree. So this hardly needs any exegesis. It is clearly a dream vision that he shares with us. And I love it that it's present tense, how valuable the present tense is ultimately in this poem. At the beginning, of course, it's future. I will have this, and I shall have some peace there. I will arise and go now. while I stand on the roadway. I hear it. So he's moved the conditional and the future right into I hear it. He's created the present. By the end of the poem, he's right there in the present tense. I hear it in the deep heart's core. That's quite a trick that his lyric poetry allows him to move from the future tense to the conditional tense to the present tense, all within 12 lines. I'm sorry, into 14 lines.
12.
12. Right. I was an English major, not a math major. Any reaction to this?
Yeah, Bert wanted to comment, and if anybody else would, we're coming. We have a couple minutes left. Go ahead, Bert.
I think in the first stanza, he's talking about like food and the getting the material things, and then later it's the spiritual. So it's providing both.
Although as soon as you see the number 9, like the number 3, the mind goes to its spiritual components. It's a special number.
But he
Number
talks about
number 1, the number 2 are also very special in numerology in our history. But
he talks about bean rows and bee hives, which suggest
but it's a marvelous vision of simplicity throughout here. And it's one of the most anthologized of Yeats's poems.
It's interesting that the isle is called "in" is free. The word "free" in there, I don't know. It seems to fit, but
and I think we're also moved by the certainty of it, even though it's a future tense poem until it's suddenly we're hit by the present tense. The refrain, "I will arise and go now," after you've heard it how many times in this poem, it's a certainty. I will, I shall, I will. And then finally, I hear. No, it's a magical. It has the magic of true lyric poetry.
So, Karen, you wanted to comment?
Yes. As I told you earlier, Barry, I love this poem, and I didn't realize that Yeats was away from Ireland when he wrote it. And of course, it is a real place off County Donegal. But when I went to Wikipedia, and I didn't know this, it's also the name of the mythical village where John Wayne lives in A Quiet Man. It's called Innisfree. So obviously, they took that from the poem.
Thank
and
you.
Also the number 9. And recently I saw Take Me Out, which is about baseball. And like Marianne Moore, I am a big baseball fan. And there's a section that Richard Greenberg wrote that's a play-on to baseball and how wonderful it is. And he alludes to the number 9 as the multiple of 3 as being the perfect number. And he talks about, of course, 3 outs in an inning and 9 innings. And he said that there's a mystic connection there, which may or may not be true, but 9 is definitely there.
Yeats was, of course, a follower of various originally Eastern practices and then imported to the Western world by the likes of Madame Blavatsky. So even at his young age, he was involved in theosophy. So, yeah. Do we have time for anything else, Judy?
Yep, you got 10 minutes.
No, let's go to this poem. It's so different on page 50. We will not have time to discuss it, but we've got time to look at it. And I would like to go first to the bottom of it, where Karen Kapoor, who I never heard of before stumbling on this, it gives us a background. At the bottom of the poem, and this is a current events poem. Where is it? I'm looking for it in the book. Page 51. She writes, if we could skip down to page 51. At the very bottom of that page, she comments, this was sent into the journal Rattle, which sends out a poem every day to subscribers. And they have a special section of poems on current events. And it wasn't so long ago, I think this summer, that Salman Rushdie was nearly murdered while about to give a talk at Chautauqua. And Karen Kapoor writes, as of now, and she states the time, Salman Rushdie's condition is unclear.
Right.
Well, that's been a while ago. He survived it, but he's still not completely well. Last month, I brought his book with me to a Bombay visit, thinking his hometown would be an excellent place to enter into his most prized fictional world. And she bought a lot of his books there. My partner and I recently studied his master class, which is a novel, eagerly discussing his wisdom and wit. The many articles and statements coming out at present about this deplorable attack speak volumes. I'm sitting here and have only my sadness and this poem to offer. Without Salman Rushdie, literary canon would have been a monochromatic field of bright stars. His works and the works they inspired and the diverse works that he endorsed have shown the sun on the South Asian literary world. We cannot lose him. And we've not lost him. The medical treatment that came immediately saved his life. His would-be killer is still pleading innocence, which to me is extraordinary when the whole world saw what he did. So this poem came out of that. I don't want to go over the time, Judy. We've got 5 minutes. I can read it, and then next week, I promise first thing, we'll come back to this. This is
And we'll
not
be sure to put it in the poetry
yeah.
poems for next week too.
Of course. So she writes, it starts with an epigraph from Salman Rushdie. I do think of Bombay as my hometown. There are streets I walked when I was learning to walk. It's a place that my imagination has returned to more than anywhere else. She begins, I have spent nearly a month in Bombay with a copy of Midnight's Children on my book stack, taunting me. Each time I think, let me open the first page. Each time I remember another place I have to be. You called it your love letter to India. Being from Delhi, I often don't understand why anyone would write a love letter to India. Sky, a tar pit of cancer. Yamuna, more akin to a block of frozen sewage than waving black water. Each small street bloated with buildings and crowds, like a starving child's belly sick with kwashakar. Bombay is more polluted than Delhi, but it boasts an ocean. Is Bombay rain different from Delhi rain? It is a question of lily or acid. The sun appears here like answered prayers, unpredictable, infrequent, and always more beautiful falling on your face through a veil than stitched into skin. Outside my window, above your book, the clouds are compliant, smoothing through gray-blue sky like children off to school. Wind bulldozes through a banyan's dreadlocks. Isn't it funny how telling the truth often feels most like lying, like doing something wrong? Here it is midnight, and I'm awake because in New York you have been stabbed. We aren't sure how many times. I glance again outside the window and think of water, think of thirst, think of opening my mouth, think of moths, and think of how could anything as natural as music make one a criminal. A child, blue beneath half aglow streetlight, is trying to stretch a blanket over his body in the hopes that it might become fire, engulf his cold. His father snores nearby. No mother in sight. I refresh my screen. Ghost a hand into the sticky air. Feel pinpricks of light, salt rain. Wonder, are you allowed back in India? Please come back with your eyes open. So, this is not a famous poem. This poem was written at the center of an emergency, and it may not have the memorable lines of a Shakespeare or a Yeats, but it's as moving to me today as the others. So we'll come back to this first thing next week and
Great.
proceed through poems that provide pleasure.
Thank you so much, Barry. You may not be good at numbers, but you remembered when to end on time. So, and it's a delight, as always, to have you with us. So can we all please thank Barry and everybody who joined today? Thank you so much.